Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the final part of our summit here in glorious Puerto Rico. Single-use plastic, the bane of so many areas of the globe. Shh, thank you. We had been making inroads into a reuse and recycle model, but COVID-19 saw us returning to take, make, dispose, not least with the millions, if not billions, of antigen tests required to go about our pandemic-limited lives. Thankfully, we're now back on the horse, so how do we future-proof travel and tourism, reduce waste and single-use plastics, and embrace circularity? A new word that I hadn't actually heard until I was researching for today, and I know that our panel are going to be talking about it in more detail. They are Christopher Gaffney, and he is, or Chris as I should say, Clinical Associate Professor in the Tisch Center for Hospitality at New York University. His research examines the dynamic processes through which the World Cup and Olympic Games impact cities, amongst other things, particularly the role of infrastructure and development. Then we have, hi Mariela, fantastic glasses, Mariela Valinez Fernandez, Exec Director of Puerto Rico Conventions District Authority. And just at the end for us there is Bob Martineau, Senior Partner at Finn Partners in Nashville. Bob is leading the agency's environment, energy and sustainability practice in the Southeast. You will of course have questions for our panelists, so please go ahead in the way that we did with the app previously. Let's start off with, if you don't mind, Chris, while you're right next to me, talk to me about what are the downsides of hosting a World Cup or an Olympics coming to town?
Well, there are a lot of downsides. I'm sure we're familiar with the developments around the Qatari World Cup and the thousands of workers that have died for the stadiums, building the stadiums there. But in every place where the Olympics and World Cup go, they bring rapid infrastructure development that tends to bring in a lot of changes that are not either necessary or go through normal democratic channels. So stadiums, militarization of police forces, surveillance technologies, gentrification, new highways that blast through neighborhoods, a lot of forced removals, and generally the insertion of capital flows into an otherwise dynamic but livable city becomes something that's dominated by the production of the event for 7 years, and then afterwards they have to deal with the consequences of those interventions.
And as I said to you in the green room, no, because the London Olympics 2012 was a massive success, and you told me why it wasn't.
Well, the narrative of those successes tend to be driven by the countries that have hosted them. So the British press was quite favorably disposed to the London Olympics, where they're quite not favorably disposed to the Rio Olympics, whereas the Brazilian press was quite the opposite. So what we saw in London was the use of the Olympic Games to open the East End of London to vectorize development in that direction. It also removed a lot of small and medium enterprises, displaced thousands of people from their traditional homes, and opened the region for development and gentrification. And those promises of social housing have not been fulfilled, and you actually, in order to get into the Olympic Park, you now have to pass through a shopping mall. And so it's a bit of a calling card for global consumption patterns, and that's usually what happens at World Cup and the Olympics, is that they are promoted by the big global companies, run of course by FIFA and the IOC, who are notoriously non-transparent and have various criminal charges against their leadership, and so they're not very good or reliable business partners, and unleash this wave of creative destruction in the cities in which these games are hosted.
Goodness, there we are. That's me told, isn't it? Now, those visitors, Mariela, they generate a lot of single-use plastic, I think it's fair to say. How big a problem is it still, single-use plastic? And what other resources are available to us?
Okay, first of all, when you work like I do in venues that are all about gathering large groups of people, you're always going to encounter the problem of large amount of garbage and waste. So in that sense, single-use plastic continues to be a problem. I believe that not as bad as it used to be, because mainly because of technology, we have been able to identify different products and alternatives in the market that substitute adequately products that are very harmful to the earth and to the environment. So in that sense, what we're doing, at least here in Puerto Rico Convention Center and Coliseo de Puerto Rico, we're using biodegradable products. When we serve like our food and beverage, we tell people that they can bring their own cups, like the Yetis, and this new market that's out there that when we analyzed it, it has truly contributed. I did my homework too before coming to this panel, and the impact it's had on diminishing the amount of plastic cups in events that gather a large amount of people. It's really important, and it's made a huge difference. I think we have so much more to do, but I think that we are seeing in this generation the result of the educational campaigns that began probably 2 decades ago, when we had no idea of how important recycling was. We always heard of the global warming problem, and now we're actually seeing the effects of that global warming. So that, added to the fact that this generation is a lot more conscious of this problem, it made it a lot easier for us, to deal with this reality every single day we host an event.
I remember going to Rwanda, must be more than a dozen years ago, and I wasn't aware until I got to the airport, arrived at the airport, that they don't allow plastic bags into the country. They're illegal. So everything was all over the floor, off the baggage conveyor, and I had to then repack everything. I think they do the same in Kenya now. Is that something that Puerto Rico would benefit from?
I believe that any effort that is done in order to diminish the amount of waste that we're going to eventually have out there is a good effort. However, in Puerto Rico, I think we need much more than that. We're an island, and our space is just limited. We don't go on forever, although we would love to. So in that case, I think we need to have much more. A much more impact, a bigger impact on what we need to do. I believe that maybe it does have an effect, but I think that we need to aim to much stronger and much more efforts in that direction.
I want to come back to you on that, but first I want to bring in Bob, if I may. Hi, Bob. Talk to me, what does circulatory mean to you?
Well, a circular economy, we started out with the concept of recycling and thinking about taking things that were destined for the landfill and recycling, and whether that's aluminum cans, very common, some of our compost materials. And circularity brings in a broader concept, really, of trying to think about how we develop products maybe to not create a waste that will biodegrade and not be a disposal problem. Because as we know, one, when you're in landlocked areas, landfill space is very finite. We used to take it out and dump it in the ocean, create all sorts of problems. And things like plastics go on forever. Most of the plastics ever created are still in existence. So how do we want to encourage recycling. We want to think on the circularity, how do we reuse or reduce the usage of materials in the first place? What can we reuse, take it, and have it become another product? So food waste can be recovered as compost material and used another purpose. Metals and scrap tires can be built in and phased into asphalt highways and blended in with the asphalt, and they actually extend the life of the road. And it's a great secondary use for tires. Just a couple of examples of how you think about the circular economy, putting something back in as a raw material for a downstream use rather than ending up being burned or landfilled.
So is circularity just a 2020s word for recycling?
Well, it's a little bit more concept than that. Recycling assumes you're sort of creating the waste in the first place. And the idea with a circular economy is you're looking at things that regenerate or don't create a waste, or are renewable products that sort of reprocess and turn into something else or become a byproduct that's used. Some of it's still recycling, but there are other things that just don't create the waste in the first place by how you use it. It biodegrades and dissolves into nothing, so it doesn't ever become a waste that has to get reused.
Chris, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right to think of it in these broader terms, but I also would in listening to the other conversations today and thinking about circularity, that we also need to think of ourselves as circular beings. So when we travel somewhere, we also bring lessons back from someplace. And this is how tourism can be a really powerful tool of education, not just for ourselves, but the lessons that we bring back from places to, and I remember my parents had the slide deck and they'd have their friends over when they came back from a trip and they'd show the slides. Now we do this with our phones, say, oh, look where I went, isn't this cool? But we don't really talk about what we learned as much, and so okay, wasn't this cool? I volunteered, or I saw this really interesting way they're dealing with waste. And that's the kind of circularity that these circular practices can bring to us as people who travel, and that we can use the experience of travel as a way to educate ourselves, and then to bring that back and have those ideas themselves circulate through us to the places where we live.
And this as a region, the Caribbean and North America, where does that stand on the world stage of being aware of circularity?
I don't know. I don't know where on the world stage that is, but there is so much I live in New York City, and of course Puerto Rico and New York City have an intimate connection, and there's always this circularity between New York City and Puerto Rico. And so the practices that are engaged here in Puerto Rico can have an impact in New York City and vice versa. And I think we need to do a better job of reaching out to people like AOC and having her come to the island to bring best practices, circular economies, and these kind of regenerative principles that are now in vogue, to actually ground them in place and to use that connection between Caribbean and North America as a real leverage point for making progress.
Tell us more about that, Mario.
I believe so. Like my generation, we used to speak about recycling. This circularity is totally a new word. That's, we've been starting to listen about it recently. And once again, I believe that the same way that my generation learned about recycling is the same way that this new generation is going to learn about circularity. And it's, for me, the way I see it, maybe in the most simplest of ways, is just avoiding for something to get to the trash can. As simple as that. Like, for instance, here in the convention center, we're trying to work on getting the funding to have our rainwater harvesting system. That would be awesome for us to be autosufficient in order to produce our own water and not to keep wasting the earth's resources. So in that case, like I said before, in the simplest of forms is just identify the way that you could avoid of needing or recurring to the need of using new things. Just, learn of how to reuse what we have and how to encounter different alternatives in order to keep avoiding producing unnecessary things.
I was speaking to one of our contributors earlier, who was one of our panelists, and she was telling me there's a new hotel that's opened in Italy on Lake Como, and they take the water from the lake for the air conditioning, and then the water then goes back into the lake. So cost effective completely, but also good for the environment. I was slightly leading the witness, Bob, when I was asking about where the US and the Caribbean stands as opposed to other parts of the world, because in Europe, it's a much smaller landmass, and so they have to be much more aware of what to do. There isn't the landfill available that there might be in bigger areas like North America.
I think that's definitely true, and I think the island, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, where you're landlocked, it's becoming much more aware of it. And with things like plastics recycling and waste, the tourism, as has been discussed today, is such a vital part of the economy in those areas that trying to address sustainability and some of the ocean plastics and things like that are critical to the economic success. And that's really, I think, we're marrying up. As Ray said, younger people are wanting it. They want sustainable tourism. They're asking questions of where they're working or where they're traveling about the commitment to sustainability to patronize those places or to work at them. So that generation is demanding it. And at the end of the day, I think particularly in the tourism industry, what is sustainable is also making great economic sense. If you're reducing the amount of towels and sheets that you're washing, and you're reducing the amount of laundry you have to do because people don't change their sheets every day and change their towels every day, that's an incredible savings of water and energy usage at the hotel, plus staff resources to that. If you're not doing all the little plastic shampoo bottles and throwing them out, or having your guests take 4 or 5 of them home with them in their suitcase, and you're doing the large pump bottles, it's a huge economic benefit as well as being very proactive in a sustainable way. So that you know, however you get there from a pure cost standpoint or from your sort of passion for a sustainable business outcome, you're going to get to the same place these days.
Those seem like no-brainers, Mariella. How many hotels and the like are doing that here in Puerto Rico?
I wouldn't have a specific number, but I can tell you that the tendency is to move towards using this large, how do you call them?
The little pump bottles.
The little pump bottles in order for, you know, just for the housekeeping to refill the bottle and avoid, you know, using the little ones that we're used to in hotels. You do see that a lot here in Puerto Rico. You see the practice of the little cardboard that says if you don't need to wash your towels every day, please just live, you know, so it's the small things that are going to get us there. But yes, definitely Puerto Rico is joining that effort in our industry.
Chris, how much more aware do you think the younger generation is? How much more are they actually taking in what difference they can make to try to save the planet?
I think it's much more. I mean, if you look at the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z sees what's coming and they're scared. Climate anxiety is real for them. Boomers, they're off, so they're not so worried about it. They're just going to continue consuming until they die, and maybe even afterwards. So whatever, thanks boomers, you know. But Gen Z is really worried. My students are really worried about it, and they're trying to figure out how they can be genuinely engaged in solving these problems. And I think they understand circularity as part of that. And if we think of the circular economy as, and I would go back and say that we all live on an island, and it's Earth, and so we can't. There's nowhere to put. There's nowhere to off-source it. Well, for Elon Musk and Bezos, they can go to whatever planet they want with their trash, and they can take our trash with them if they want to. Let's see where he goes. But the idea that circularity, even if we have a circular economy and we're recycling, but if you're in Puerto Rico and you buy your recyclable or sustainably sourced materials from Kenya, and you're in a circle, that circle's still too big. And so it's about reducing the size of the circles of our economy and having these inputs be bioregional, or integrated with existing community dynamics, and building from the bottom up and not conceiving of places as a destination first, but as a community first, and building that resiliency from the bottom up. And I see that in millennials, Gen Z, they very much understand that, and that allows them to engage with the authenticity of place, because it's not a destination. They're going to make connections. They're going to make new friends. They're going to learn and bring those things back. And so I think that's a really positive development that's coming out of the kind of cascading crises of climate change, inequality, pollution, COVID that we're seeing now.
To the extent where they feel that activism is the only way forward, we have an organisation in the UK called Extinction Rebellion, and they glue themselves to the motorway and things. It totally divides opinion. One group of people think, I'm trying to get to work and you are in my way. And the reverends and the teachers and the nurses who've actually glued themselves to the road say, we don't want to do this, but we're doing it for the sake of your children.
Yeah, and I would say we're all activists no matter what we're doing. So if you're consuming, you're also an activist. You're just acting in a different way. And so to say that people are activists only when they're resisting is to kind of remove the responsibility from your own behavior and say you're activist, but you're actually working in a particular direction. And so, yeah, and this is one of the problems with the Olympics and the World Cup. And I'm a spoil sport because I say these are problematic events. I'm taking your cherished leisure activity every 4 years and telling you to politicize that, and to think about those choices and the ramifications of those choices that you're making when you turn on the TV or buy your ticket to the game. And the same is happening for tourism. And I think that the younger generations, my students especially, are understanding that their specific travel choices have implications, and they understand the commodity chains and the circularities that they want to be engaged in.
Mariella, what can tourists do when they come to your island particularly, but the rest of the Caribbean as well, to try to make sure that the footprint that they leave behind is not going to cause a problem for the people who live here?
I believe the fact to appreciate what we're trying to do down here. I mean, like I said before, our space is limited, and we're trying to enforce campaigns, and we're trying to teach people how to do things correctly. Like, for instance, we're trying to adopt like you said before, it's just the little things. I went to Disney recently with my godson, he's 5 years old, and you see these trash cans that they're already divided between plastics and glass and whatever. When I was 5, I would have had no idea what to do with that trash can. And these kids, they just come with this chip and they go automatically and they know exactly what to do. So I think it's more of a worldwide educational campaign, and once we get this, I believe that Puerto Rico and every other destination is going to benefit from people knowing how to behave themselves in order to cause as little impact as possible in the environment. So I think not only to Puerto Rico, whenever we visit whichever country, we should want for that country we're visiting the same thing we want for home, so we should behave as well.
But I'm guessing, Bob, it's much more than that, and we need the big countries, the big polluters, as I was saying earlier, like China, like Australia, like Brazil, to stick to their promises, and they're not always doing that.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think the challenge, and I think we talk to people, they sometimes throw up their hands in sort of frustration or being overwhelmed that it's so complex and my piece is so little, there's nothing I can do, so it doesn't really matter what I do. And I think try to tell people is every little behavior is a behavior change that you can do. So start, wherever you are is where you start, and look forward. You can't change the past, but if you just turn off the lights, if you stop using, you start recycling your trash and aluminum cans, wherever it is, if you turn your thermostat up, if you install LED lights, and somebody talked about before, I mean, those pay for themselves very quickly. If you buy energy efficient appliances in your home or in your business, you can start making progress. But then yes, those things, and then having government policies, and I really think the youth and the younger generations will be the force in looking at investments. You now have BlackRock and other major investors looking at the sustainability of those investments they're making in making financial investment decisions. So that's going to drive that behavior to start seeing that larger culture change. Because really at the end of the day, it's a risk management thing. Those investment decisions are nothing but looking at risk management and what's the resilience of that particular business long term if they don't address climate and carbon and other sustainable issues. They don't have a consistent energy supply to run their business, then they become riskier investments. So that's how the behavior is going to change individually and more geopolitically, the larger.
But Chris, how do we hold those governments to account? India tells us that they are going to be carbon neutral by 2050. I certainly won't be here by then. A lot of people in this room actually probably will be. But there you go, that's a different story. But what do we need to do along the journey in order to make sure that they do as they say they're going to do?
Well, I guess it depends on who you mean by we.
Well,
And so this is always the question, is this a colonialist endeavor where the US and the UK that have consumed more carbon combined than most of the world? Do we have a say in how India consumes its carbon or offers its footprint? So we have a larger geopolitical question of accountability. But I think that
exactly the point.
Yeah.
Exactly the point.
But who's holding the U.S. responsible? If not the U.S., if not U.S. citizens, who's holding the U.K. responsible for their promises? And who's certainly, it depends on government. And governments are short term. They try to get as much as they can out of their term in office, and usually that involves extracting natural resources. But if we can build from the bottom, and this is where I go back to the point about circularity emerging from below, a sustainable destination is a sustainable community. Sustainable communities across a country make a sustainable or a regenerative or whatever word you want to throw on it. A country has to be built from the ground up and not. And I don't think we can abdicate the responsibility for those choices to governments. And I've heard many people say this here. We need the private sector. We need NGOs. We need the academy. We need people thinking and not trying to propose solutions, but to ask good questions. And a question like this is a really difficult one. It's a good question that needs to be, and the question will draw people around the table to find the answer. And I think that we, certainly in the academy, we try to say we have all the answers, but really what I try to get at is to have a good question, and that really is the first step towards having some kind of movement in a convivial direction.
And Mariela, an island like Puerto Rico relies on countries like the UK, the US, and others, Australia, to keep its promises. what, if anything, can your island do to try to make that happen? Or is it just asking the questions as we're hearing from Chris?
I believe, unfortunately, that is definitely the case. In Puerto Rico, like you said, we're such a small island, and we pretty much depend in a very large way of other countries to supply what we need. Our resources are limited. And in that case, what we need to do is analyze who's doing the right work and just make difficult decisions. We need to stop sponsoring countries that are not getting the job done and that are not measuring these consequences that at the end of the day, really affect us all. We could have the best project in Puerto Rico to get this done, but if countries like the US or the UK are not doing their part, there's only so much we can do. So I believe that the only way to do this is to hold them accountable for what they need to be doing.
If you've got any questions, then do please feel free to pop them onto the app, and if we've got time, we've only got about 10 minutes left, but if we've got time, of course we will share them with our panel. I'm sure you'll agree, fascinating conversation. Bob, how does a lawyer get involved in this aspect of circularity?
Well, I came at this, started my career in environmental policy as a lawyer and then shifted to be an actual public policy person running a state environmental agency and just pushing sustainability and addressing landfill issues and air issues. And I think the real message to sort of how to get to behavior change, I would make two comments. One is, you have to really try to make the connection between the environment and sustainability and public health. And it's really a health issue. We talk about smokestacks polluting and landfills, but really, and access to clean water, they're really public health issues. And I think there were studies done around the pandemic and on getting people to address climate change. And a lot of those studies showed, you could talk about the polar bear and you could talk about ice melt, and it really didn't resonate with average people. And so, but they did resonate when you started talking about whether your kids would be healthy or unhealthy or what their future was like. And I think that's where the younger generation is already been alluded to, is starting to, they are afraid of the future. For our generation, it was something off in the distance, and that was nice, and we probably ought to do something, but they didn't see their lifestyle change. Now they're seeing some of the impacts of climate change, lack of access to clean water and things. So if you make it relatable to people and their children, I think you'll start to see more change, because they do see that the future may be different if they don't step up and act.
Mariello, may I put a question to you from the audience, please? Thank you very much indeed, whoever sent this in. What are some practical long-term goals when it comes to developing a circular economy for food waste?
For food waste, that's an interesting topic here in Convention Center when we host so many large groups that actually, require to be fed. So what we're doing is mostly, like for instance, going back to the simple things. Vegetable oil, the oil we use to cook. We're working on installing a system that allows us to recycle the oil we use to cook in the convention center. That might sound like a small effort, but when you take into consideration the amount of food and the amount of people we receive yearly in our venue, that is going to make a huge difference. Add to the fact that less oil, less plastic, and where the oil comes in. So when you keep adding these small efforts, at the end of the day, they do have the capability of making a difference. And the food, whichever excess food we have, we're identifying different suppliers that have recently established in Puerto Rico in order to give them the excess food that we get, from the different activities, and to turning that into compost. We're having very aggressive agricultural campaigns in Puerto Rico, especially in these days when we're finally realizing how difficult the market is getting and how difficult it could be potentially to get the adequate amount of food in Puerto Rico. So we're turning our attention to agriculture. So in that effort, we have identified these new companies that are establishing that do have a proper use for this excess food. So this is a changing market every single day. We're facing new challenges every single day, and that has put to our, we do have more resources available in order to come up with new ways to minimize what we're producing.
Thank you for that. Another question from our audience. I'm not sure if it's in the room or virtually, but either way, thank you for this. Bob, perhaps you could take it. How can we make recycling more accessible to the general population and not just tourists?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways. I mean, I think you take some of the best practices wherever they start. If they start in the hospitality industry and then you expand it to the general population. And I think you can go back to have incentives. United States, where I always grew up, if you had public waste pickup, trash pickup as part of, you paid your local property tax. There was no incentive to reduce the amount of waste you generated. You paid the same in your property tax or in your waste disposal fee, regardless of how many pounds of waste you created every week. Now you see municipalities saying, look, we want to change that policy. We want to disincentivize people from creating waste. So we set up recycling programs and we penalize, or we charge you more sort of volume-based waste disposal. That will get people to start thinking about spreading it out to the general population. And the other thing we've done very poorly in the past is look at the life cycle cost of those. We know what the trash costs to pick up, and we have a tipping fee to dispose of it in the landfill, but we don't think about the 100-year maintenance of that landfill, over time in the cost.
Okay, we are in our last 5 minutes. Do you want to pick up on that one, or do you want to go with this next one?
Yeah, I'll pick. They're kind of the same. But
okay.
so
the other question that's just come in, just because we can see it and they can't see. Our world in data in 2018, electricity and heat have the highest carbon footprint in the US. How can industries individually work to reduce this?
So relative to the previous question as well, I have a really annoying habit as a professor of changing the question to make it a little more complicated. So apologies for that. So can't help it. But putting the responsibility on the individual is a great way of hiding the problem. And so I think we all have some guilt about, am I recycling enough? And I know in New York we do this thing we call aspirational recycling, where we throw the thing in a bin and someone comes and picks it up and we assume that it's been recycled, but no one has any idea of the actual supply chain of that. So, but when no one talks about putting the responsibility on the producer of the bottle, or what is the responsibility of Coca-Cola for recycling the things that they sell? What is the responsibility of the shampoo company for producing or engaging the plastic bottles? And so when we take the responsibility on ourselves, we think, oh my God, my individual actions are destroying the world, and that creates a lot of guilt for people, especially younger people that don't understand the systemic realities of it. Similarly, for industries that are engaged in systems that are hard to break out of, and systems mean infrastructure. Government builds infrastructure, and so we are channeled through a systemic path that is very difficult to move away from. And those things take time. And so again, we need to ask the question, what do you mean by recycling? What are we recycling? How are we recycling it? What does it mean that these particular outputs of an energy cycle are released into the atmosphere? And so one of the things in talking with circularity with my students, I say you should embrace circularity before it embraces you, because we see this coming back again and again. COVID is a result of human interaction with the environment, right? This is a global crisis that comes from our overconsumption, that comes from our infinitely expanding footprint on this very limited island. So unless we embrace these ideas, they're going to embrace us in ways that we really may not like so much.
Almost out of time. Mariella, what message do you want our audience to take, whether they're here or virtually, what message do you want them to take away today?
I believe that the message that we just cannot avoid from this discussion is the fact that we're starting to see things we had only heard about. Like I said before, global warming used to be mentioned frequently, and we had never had the chance to see the actual consequence of global warming like we're seeing it today. So I believe that we should all leave here knowing that at some point this is going to get to us, and at some point this is going to keep affecting future generations in a much more difficult way than it's starting to affect us. So if we leave with that thought, I think that's going to automatically take us to the fact that we need to start contributing in making a difference.
Well, what message?
Yeah, I think that's right. We have to realize the problem is real. It's going to have an immediate, it's having immediate impacts. It's going to have and that we need to, if you haven't started, start, but be recognition. And we look all across the board, individual behavior, what can government as public policy institutions, what can investors do to drive behavior? I think the young generations are driving that behavior. They're asking those questions about the sustainability, and that's how we're going to get progress.
Okay, Chris, let's finish where we started, talking about the Olympics and the World Cup, and you talked about what that means for a city that wins that. What advice would you offer to Paris for the Summer Olympics of 2024, or indeed the US for the 2026 World Cup?
To take the problem seriously. I think anyone that watched the Champions League final a few weeks ago saw the mess that was outside of the Saint-Denis Stadium. Gentrification, militarization, surveillance technologies, all are real and enduring legacies of these events. And so if you want Saint-Denis to be a healthy, vibrant community, do not invest in surveillance technology. That need the education, access to public space, decent transportation, community spaces, green spaces, access to clean water, all those things should be prioritized way above new hotels, new metros connecting to various parts of the city. For the U.S., we've had lots of human rights violations in the U.S. in the last couple of years. Police violence is a real thing. Doubling down on the military presence in World Cup cities is not the way to go. I wrote the human rights assessment for the 2026 bid to have cities compete on their human rights platform, on the index, and that report was summarily thrown out once they got the bid. So it's not being taken seriously, and so mayors of U.S. cities who are hosting or bidding to host the World Cup in 26 need to take these dynamics quite seriously, or it's going to be worse than it was before.
Wow. Fascinating stuff, guys. It went so quickly, didn't it? Chris, Mariella, Bob, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.